Alright folks, Sega Sonic Fan here, and today I'm going to be showing you more than you ever wanted to know about how to hack and reverse engineer a KVM switch. What's a KVM switch? Well, I think it stands for Keyboard, Video, and Mouse Switch. These were popular back in the 90s, and in some iteration they still are today. This particular one has VGA, which is very useful for a number of reasons, which I will get into soon. First, let's unbox this thing. Not that this is all that exciting, but just thought I'd show it anyway, since I had all the packaging. Oh, dropping things here. And what's cool about this thing is it's nice and small. And the reason why I wanted one that does VGA, well, aside from the stuff that I still have quite a few computer items that I don't mind using VGA instead of HDMI. Comes with these cables. Comes with 4 of them, in fact. But the main reason I wanted to hack this was to use video game RGB output signals from my favorite game consoles, and to be able to easily switch them between different video game consoles. What's cool about this one is you have buttons that all light up, and you can easily just hit a button and be on your different game console. So what's the problem? Why can't I just plug this in and be good and happy with my new inboxed KVM switch and be ready to go? Well, there's a big problem, folks, and that is it uses proprietary custom cables. In this, it looks like a typical, VGA output, no problem. But in fact, it is a problem because this is not standard VGA signals that are passed through on this thing. In fact, these special cables have the PS2 keyboard and mouse serial data embedded in the VGA pinout. These are not PlayStation 2, that's just the serial interface that was popular at the time. This was, back in the day, this was your mouse connection, and this was your keyboard connection. And what sucks about that is if you plug in a regular VGA cable, something like this, which is just straight VGA, you've probably seen these before, it will crash. It will lock up, and it won't. These buttons will no longer recognize, and you won't be able to change your input. Kind of sucky, right? Kind of defeats the purpose of this thing if you have to use custom cables, and then it's always looking for this data on the mouse and keyboard. Otherwise, it won't work. So, of course, I didn't like that. And I do like this switch, though. So I wanted to figure out what I could do about that. And so here I'm going to take you on a journey into the KVM switch. First thing we're going to do, open it up. And I've already done the modifications. So I will go over what I did, and then I will go over why I did it and how I came up with the solution that I did. Because you'll notice here I added some nice rubber feet. This is to keep it from moving around in my TV stand. And those you can get very, very cheap. I got my batch from Jameco. You can just get these nice little rubber feet dealios. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to open this up. And we'll see inside here. I'm going to zoom in. See if the camera will focus, and it will. Cool. So what do we got inside here? Well, we have a microcontroller, the MDT2020BP. Now I know that's just a sticker, but it actually is in fact the microcontroller that's in there. It's an EEPROM-based microcontroller, which is pretty interesting. We have, of course, a 7805 regulator, which will take the power coming in and basically anything up to probably up to 20 volts. These capacitors are rated at 25 volts, and it'll step it down to 5 volts, a nice clean 5 volts for all the circuitry in here. And other than that, we've got, of course, our ports, and then we've got all these little guys, which are in fact your analog switches, also known as multiplexers, analog multiplexers. We have a piezo tweeter to give an audible, beep whenever a new switch is pressed, and a little bit of passive circuitry as well. Also, originally, on the right side there, we had a chip that I removed, which is the 74HC4052, which is another analog multiplexer. And I'll go into what that's for a little bit later on. So first, what do we need to do to make this completely compatible with any VGA source? And it will no longer work with keyboard and mouse, but who cares, because everyone uses USB nowadays. Nobody uses that stuff anymore. I mean, I say that, maybe some person out there is like, no, but boy, I can't imagine too many people being sad about letting go of those old connectors. So what you need to do, if you are interested in doing this modification, and there's a couple optional steps as well, but primarily it consists, actually let me put this under the microscope. Well, I'll show it first, and then I might show it under the microscope. So primarily it consists of cutting 8 traces to the microcontroller that are detect pins for the keyboard and mouse serial data. In addition to that, I removed that chip over here I mentioned just a minute ago. And so, yeah, let me just go through what you do, and then I'll explain why. So you remove this chip, which is a 74HC4052. You jump a wire from pin 3 to the 5-volt source here. The 5-volt source is fused, by the way, by that fuse. And then on the back here, what you do is you cut a number of traces, basically the traces to, I'm trying to remember which, I'll actually pull up the data sheet off camera here so I can tell you the exact pins. Basically pin, what is it, pin 14 down here. You want to isolate pins 14, 15, 16, 17, as well as pins 22, 23, 24, and 25, which are over here. Now to do that, I'll try to zoom in. I'll see if the camera will do a good job of this, and if not, I will put it under the microscope. But essentially, there's a trace here. Now this via goes to pin 14, just so you know. So you cut that trace, you cut that trace, you cut that trace, and you cut that trace. So you isolated those 4 pins, and then you also cut this trace over here, which also goes to pin 14. Now, after you're doing that, you cut the 4 traces here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now, after you've cut all those traces, I'll make a quick note. There are some pull-up resistors over here. These 4 pull-up resistors actually pull up the pins for 14, 15, 16, and 17, so those don't need pull-up resistors. However, these 4 do, because there's no pull-up resistors. So I added 4 10 kilo ohm pull-up resistors. All 4 of those, the other side of them goes to ground because they're pull-up resistors. Or sorry, goes to 5 volts because they're pull-up resistors. And that's pretty much it. Additionally, there's some optional steps you can take, which one of them I do highly recommend. And the one I highly recommend is to replace the diode here with a fuse. And the other one is, if you are annoyed by this beep, the really loud beep that this makes, the way that I am, go ahead and cut the trace. There's a trace right here that goes from the output of this transistor to the piezoelectric tweeter, and cut that trace. I added a 330 ohm resistor back to that connection, and now it's pretty quiet. Actually works out pretty well. So that's what you do if you want to make this fully VGA compatible. Now I will explain why. And I will do it with a video aid as well. So first off, I went ahead and I did a number of things to learn all this. One is I actually took some notes and reverse engineered stuff. And so I've got all these notes. I originally made these notes back in 2017. So wow, this has been a while, 4 years making this video. So 4 years since I first did this hack, and I came up with a number of improvements, and I will explain them. So these notes cover quite a lot pretty well, actually. I was, not super disappointed with my work 4 years ago. It did a pretty good job. I don't know if you can read those notes. They're chicken scratch. But to stop the LED blinking, you jump 5 volts for the 74HC4052. And then up here is like the, I traced out both ports, figured out where they went, and figured out how to cut these pins. The thing that really threw me off, though, is it turns out that the microcontroller actually has, so there's 4 pins that go to these ports. right, for serial data. Serial data for one of them and serial data for the other. There's 4 pins. So I cut those 4 pins and I thought I was done. There's actually 8 that you have to cut, though, because the analog switches actually drive 8 pins, which is kind of weird. But basically how I figured this out was these are all analog switches. They just swap data around. Basically, it's literally like a switch. So there's like 4 inputs, 1 output. And based on the setting, it will select one of those. And I'm going to go up to the monitor here and show you all the data sheet for the part. So I put this under my microscope, and I guess I'll go ahead and just turn on my microscope really quick so we can walk through this together as I drop a little PCB thing. And so when I put this under my microscope, you will see that we've got these switches in here, the IDT QS3253. Hopefully that's coming up clear enough there. And so that's our main switch. Aside from that microcontroller, there's just these switches all over the place. And the part that threw me off, by the way, is that these switches, for reasons I don't actually know yet, and don't care because I've already got it working the way I want, but they're actually connected in parallel. So actually this set is connected to that set. And the output pins, which by the way are pin 9 and pin 7, which is this via right here, are what lead back to the microcontroller. However, it's pin 9 and pin 7 for both chips. And that's why we have 8 pins total at the microcontroller. So 2 pins for each chip. And now I'll go to the schematic here, the data sheet, and explain a little more what's going on here. So, like I said, it's a multiplexer. It's a bunch of switches that switch on and off. There's these select pins and then these enable pins, and our output and our input. And if we look here, you'll see there's, for the Y's, YA in this case, there's 0, 1, 2, and 3, 4 inputs, and then the 1 output, which is YA, and then over here, it's the same thing, 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then YB is the output. So like I said, pin 7 and pin 9 are the outputs. Now when I traced everything, sort of painstakingly, back to the microcontroller, what I discovered was that the microcontroller, of course, has a bunch of I/O inputs, and you can see here they're just TTL input I/O inputs. By the way, TTL means that they're logic, they're 0 to 5 volts logic. So I'll go back to that in a minute. But it's pretty basic microcontroller. You've got your reset pin, you've got a real-time clock, you've got an oscillator, and you've got these inputs. We're only concerned about the inputs. And so what I found was PB4, PB5, PB6, and PB7 went to one set of those switches, and then PC 7, 6, 5, and 4 went to another set. So as long as you isolate all these pins, the microcontroller doesn't know that you're not using a keyboard and a mouse. And lastly, if you're going to isolate all the pins, you have to make sure they're pulled logic high. And essentially when you plug in a VGA cable that isn't standard, it pulls them logic low, and so that's what confuses it and makes it lock up. So as long as you keep everything at 5 volts, the microcontroller is tricked basically. You kind of fake it out, and it thinks that you have connected, you either have nothing connected or you've connected the things that it wants you to, which is using that proprietary cable. So it's pretty simple. And then lastly, of course, after the fact, it's simple, right? After the hours of reverse engineering everything. But if we look over here at the microcontroller, you'll see, like I mentioned before, there are these 4 pull-up resistors that are 22 kilo ohms. You can use 10 kilo ohms. It doesn't matter. They're just, they need to be high impedance or high resistance. So yeah, you have those 4 pull-up resistors for the PB pins, but the PC pins, 22 to 26, don't actually have those pull-up resistors. So you have to add your own on the bottom. And then this chip right here that I removed, the 74HC4052, what this does is this just switches the 5 volts, the power output on VGA, which by the way is pin 9 on a VGA plug. And it uses that 5 volts to basically, blink or not blink the LEDs when you're selecting. So if you get annoyed by that LED blinking nonstop, all you have to do is remove that chip and then connect pin 3 to the 5 volt source. And that's because that's your output. And aside from that, you're in good shape. And the reason, by the way, I recommended to replace that diode with a fuse, as you see there under the microscope, but I'll go back to the main view here. The reason I recommended replacing that diode with a fuse is because this is TTL logic. And so I had one that was been running for a number of years actually, and I had a power outage and it started acting up real bad. And I found that this actually fixed the issue, and I was like, that's a bit weird. Well, I wondered why, and the reason why is because when things are TTL logic level, they like to be 5 volts, either 5 volts or ground. And when you have a diode drop like that coming out of a 5 volt regulator, there's a voltage drop. All diodes have a voltage drop across them. And in this case, it's about 0.3 volts. But that is enough of a voltage difference to start confusing some of the pins on the microcontroller potentially. And so at least that's my theory why it was acting up, because the microcontroller can be confused if there's as little as a 0.4 volt difference. And so that 0.3 volt is not exactly a constant when it comes across that diode there. So yeah, it's kind of good to basically give it a steady solid 5 volts, which is kind of what it's expecting in the first place. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. I'll show it to you plugged in and working. And I'll also show, just because why not, the notes I made when I was tracing everything out. Is pretty ridiculous. This is all the notes I was making when I was tracing out the PC and PB pins, and then which chips they went to, which pins of the chip. Hopefully this is showing up on the camera, just for record's sake. So these are the VGA pins. These are the pins of the microcontroller. These are the silk labeled chip, which is that analog switch that I just mentioned, which is the QS3253. And then lastly, these are the pins from the respective QS chips. So yeah, that's pretty much it. A lot of work to get a VGA switch going, but I learned a lot, and I think it was worth it because I really like this thing. It's nice and compact, does a really good job, and those switches are pretty high quality. And now you can see it's no longer locking up. You can select everything really easily, regardless of having a VGA signal coming in. Basically, it doesn't care what signals are coming in now, because it thinks that it's getting what it wants. I've tricked it. So yeah, hopefully somebody found this video interesting or useful. Have fun hacking old equipment. And I am planning on making a follow-up video to this where I will put my own microcontroller in here and add a remote control, because that is one feature that I would really like to add. I'm sort of debating adding a USB port for power, but I don't really care that much if I have to use a socketed power like this, but it would be kind of cool. I'm just thinking of like what updates I could do, upgrades, because now I have full control, as it were. And yeah, the cool thing about these two is I've left this plugged in for like literally years, and it had no issues whatsoever. It's just such a nice, clean design, very basic, to the point. And by the way, all the inputs in the microcontroller have built-in Schmidt triggers, which is really cool. So the buttons register really, really well. Only complaint I have about the buttons, there's actually two small complaints I would like to make for anyone out there, any of you mechanical engineers out there, or electrical engineers out there. First, number one, try not to ever make buttons with really long shafts like this. These are a DTS6 button, and when you have a really long protruded shaft like this, you don't necessarily hit the center of the diaphragm inside the button. It kind of angles it, and it's basically a recipe for future mechanical failure. So whenever you use DTS buttons, make the protruding shaft of the plastic of your enclosure the thing that hits the button, not the other way around, and you will have much longer lasting buttons with less mechanical failures. These are highly, highly prone to mechanical failure. And number two, the way this is programmed is the buttons are actuated on a rising edge instead of the falling edge. What that means is that when you press it, it doesn't actually switch. It switches when you lift up your finger. I just made it unhappy. But if you hold it and then you kind of like remove your finger, then it switches. And that's weird. Personally, I think it should switch when you click it, not when you release it. So that's a simple programming error in my my opinion, but not a huge one. And I originally thought you had to remove all these resistors down here, but you don't. Those are actually pull-up resistors for the inputs that you're no longer using. And those are good because you don't want to leave inputs on these switches oscillating, essentially, without a known voltage source. So you can leave those in place. And yeah, that's more information than you probably ever wanted to know about KVM VGA Switch Hacking. If you're interested in the future video I talked about, where I add a remote to this and a microcontroller in the future, let me know. And if you like videos like this, let me know. I like reading comments from folks that appreciate these weird free tutorials that I do, hacking tutorials. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So have fun hacking out there. This is Sega Sonic Fan, signing out.